Appendix 3, A Mary for All. I'm including this article to show how all outward forms of the Christian religion come short of the reality of the message and truth of the gospel, and attempts to interpret ancient culture with the learning of this world will shine no light on the truth. If this article gets too technical, view my comments on page 94, which is a summary of this matter. The Economist, December 20th, 2003. Imagine what you would think if you had grown up with a little knowledge of Christianity, and you arrived in midwinter in a country whose culture and spirituality have been shaped by the faith in one of those most traditional varieties. In other words, if you found yourself observing the celebration of Christ's Nativity in a country dominated by Roman Catholics, or by the Greek or Russian Orthodox Church, or in an ancient outpost of Christendom like Ethiopia or Armenia. You might have questions about the sex of the worshippers and of the divinity being worshipped. As you walked into the church, you would notice some impressive robed people singing, speaking and gesturing at the far end, either in view of the congregation or else in a partly enclosed space from which they periodically emerge. Both these robed celebrants and almost certainly their assistants would all be male, and no female would be allowed to enter the semi-enclosed space. Yet most of the worshippers might well be female. Then you might begin to wonder about who or what was being addressed in the ceremonies you were watching, and your confusion would be even greater as you studied both the seasonal decorations, the greeting cards, the cribs, the nativity scenes, and also more permanent fixtures like statues, icons, and mosaics. You might well conclude that the main person being celebrated and adored was not a newborn babe, but his mother. The impression of a maternally oriented religion would be specially powerful if you entered one of the many Eastern Christian churches, where the fresco or mosaic of a giant figure of Mary with a relatively small figure of Christ superimposed filled the concave space above the altar, seeming to tower over the worshippers. This sense of religion dedicated to womanhood, with or without the attribute of maternity, would be stronger still in bastions of Roman Catholic piety, such as Mexico, where simple believers often pour out their hopes and fears to an image or statue of Mary alone, without her child. And your curiosity about the divine force being evoked might grow even greater if you could follow the words being prayed and chanted all around you. Some of these words would be celebrations of a newly born babe destined to save mankind, but much of the language would be about his mother, the miraculous circumstances of her pregnancy, and the great tragedy that awaited her as her son was to meet a cruel death. Whatever you made of this story, you would find yourself appreciating one of the great cultural achievements of the Christian era. Thousands of lines of subtle and expressive religious poetry addressed to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Some of this was composed for the midwinter celebration of Christ's birth. Equally beautiful language was inspired by the 4 other feasts that the early church dedicated to Mary, each with its complex liturgical forms. From the relative handful of direct references to Mary in the Christian Gospels, a vast web of ritual and praise has been woven. Of course, if you then ask a well-instructed Roman Catholic or Eastern Christian believer about the meaning of these rituals, you would be told rather firmly about the limits of Mary's veneration. Mary is not a goddess, you will be informed, but a human being with a unique relationship to God, and therefore a unique role in praying for and protecting the human race. She is not worshipped, but rather venerated. A Roman Catholic might tell you that Mary was the co-redeemer with Christ of the human race, though this is not dogma, and that she was conceived without the original sin, that every other human being inherits. An Eastern Christian would not use quite that language, but he would acknowledge a special sort of intimacy with the Mother of God, and in particular with icons of Mary, of her Son, which no other manifestation of the divine can inspire. This would be rather puzzling if your background was entirely secular, but it would be very familiar indeed if you adhered to another monotheistic world religion, Islam. In some respects, Muslim beliefs about Mary, the most honoured woman in Islam, and the only one to have an entire chapter named after her in the Quran, seem to be quite close to those of the Roman Catholics. The Islamic tradition holds that Jesus and his mother are the only two human souls who were not touched with Satan at birth. In other respects, the Muslim understanding of Mary seems close to that of the Eastern Christians. Both cherish the story of Mary's childhood in a place of supreme holiness that had hitherto been a bastion of male priests. Both name Mary's guardian and the priest Zachariah or Zachariah in Islam. The story is told of Zachariah's bringing food to the child Mary and finding that she had already been given nourishment from God. This is cited as a sign of her extreme respectability to God. In Orthodox Christianity, it is stressed that Mary was born an ordinary human burdened like others with the capacity to sin. So much for the theology, we might say, but as an outsider, you would still wonder at the power and intensity of the metaphors that early Christian hymnographers ascribed to Mary. Among the dozens of heart-stopping turns of phrase, she is described as the dawning of the mystical day, the bride chamber bathed in light, a lily whose perfumes scent the faithful, a vessel of God's wisdom who showed up the unwisdom of the philosophers and reduced the scholars to speechlessness. In the Eastern Church, some of the finest language is subscribed for a feast at late November or early December that is based not on the New Testament but on a lesser-known Christian text called the Gospel of James. This feast celebrates the presentation of Mary as a 3-year-old child to the temple in Jerusalem, where she is described as entering the most holy place, which was normally reserved for male priests, and spending the remainder of her childhood absorbing the temple's sanctity and scholarship. Where do all these images come from? A psychotherapist in the school of Carl Jung might say that motherhood is a force that feeds and protects all humans. It is the most important of all the archetypes that lurk in humanity's collective unconscious. So any religious practice that fails to answer this will fail to satisfy its followers. For feminists, critics of traditional Christianity, the attention paid to Christ's mother is a feeble counterpoint to the male domination of every other aspect of the faith. Secular historians would link the veneration of Mary to the pre-Christian cult of feminine divinities, such as the Egyptians, Isis, who conceived by her followers as a Madonna figure, nursing a holy child, or the Romans' Diana. A somewhat different answer is offered by Margaret Baker, a Hebrew scholar and prolific writer on religious history. Her latest book, The Great High Priest, is a collection of densely woven arguments about the continuity between Islamic and early Christian practice. It touches on at least 2 interlocking themes: the sex of divinity and locus of holiness. As she and many others have observed, much of the poetry dedicated to Mary comes from what is called the wisdom tradition of the Jewish religion. This takes the form of passages in which wisdom is perceived as a form of feminine divinity. One of the most explicit references to wisdom as a sort of feminine agency or power is in the book of Proverbs. Wisdom hath builded her house, she hath killed her beast, she hath mingled her wine and furnished her table. Mrs. Baker believes that there are scores of other places in the Jewish scriptures where modern language is lurking just below the surface. Some of the language has transformed into Christianity, to Christ or the Holy Spirit, but most of it was applied to Mary. Mary Baker believes the worship of a deity in feminine form was more explicit before the catastrophe of 586 BC, when the first temple built by Solomon was destroyed and the Jews went into exile in Babylon. As evidence, she cites a passage in the book of Jeremiah where Jewish exiles in Egypt were scolded for continuing to offer cakes, libations, and incense unto the Queen of Heaven. They replied definitely that everything had been going well in Jerusalem's temple and amongst the Jews generally, so long as the heavenly monarch was given her due. Only when that practice ceased had disaster befallen them. Other scholars have noticed references in the Old Testament to groves and high places where forbidden religious rites were going on, and having assumed perhaps reasonably that these too were rites associated with a feminine deity. To back her interpretation of this passage, Mrs. Baker draws on a version of the Book of Enoch, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, manuscripts whose discovery some years ago transformed Christian and Jewish scholarship. This document asserts even more clearly that the cult of a feminine force called wisdom had been a feature of that first temple, but was then abandoned disastrously. As an exercise in textual analysis, Mrs. Baker's case is almost unanswerable, albeit not entirely original. The idea of wisdom as a female agency or person also existed among the Greeks, for whom Athena was the goddess of wisdom, just as Minerva was for the Romans. More recently, in the 1930s, the idea caused furious disputes in the White Russian Dispersia in Paris, with bitter allegations of heresy being traded. No wonder, as Jane Morton, a lecturer in religion and for psychology, puts it, the Christian Church does have an understanding of wisdom as a female gift of God, but it is so subtle that almost any statement you make about it becomes heretical. The best way to understand Judeo-Christian wisdom traditionally, in Mr. Moron's view, is to think of wisdom as a creature who is not part of God, but has a unique role in mixing God and creation together. If so, it is easy to see how wisdom language was transferred to Mary. But whatever the insights offered by comparing text and metaphors, it can be hard for first-century observers to understand the sheer passion of the language that was addressed to Christ's mother in late antiquity. The all-golden vessel, the most delectable sweetener of our souls, she who bears the manna which is Christ, land uncultured, field unploughed, vine streaming with fecundity, vessel most delightful, spring that gushes forth, the treasure of innocence, the ornament of modesty. These are the words of an 8th century Byzantine sermon describing Mary's entry into the temple. To understand the preacher's passion, it helps to look at the other part of Mary Baker's argument, which has to do with the locus of holiness on earth. Like several other religions, the Jewish tradition was torn between its emphasis on the unbridgeable gap between God and human beings and its belief that, in certain circumstances, it is possible for man and the divine to come face to face. For the Jews, the unique place of encounter between man and God was the temple. Before that, it was the tabernacle or tent, constructed by Moses. Mrs. Baker's point is that only in the light of the temple or tabernacle tradition can many features of early Christianity be understood. She also believes that the reverence applies in the light of early Christian practices and ritual. It becomes easier to re-enter the world of the Jewish temple. As an example of this, she takes the central Christian rite of the Eucharist, in which bread and wine are offered to God, consecrated and then consumed by worshippers who believe the sanctified gifts enable them in some mysterious but primordial important sense to take part in the divine life of Christ. As many a religious historian has noted, there are two temple practices that foreshadow the Eucharist. One was the weekly ceremony in which 12 loaves of bread were brought into the temple, consecrated and then consumed by the high priests. The other was the annual rite that marked the high point of the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement, the only time when the priest entered the holiest of holies, the most sacred part of the temple. Before doing so, the priest would select two almost identical goats. One would be slaughtered, and its blood was taken into the Holy of Holies before being sprinkled on various parts of the temple. The other was sent out into the desert as a scapegoat, bearing the sins of the people. As one standard translation puts it, the priest would sacrifice one goat for the Lord and the other to a demonic force called Azazel. But Mrs. Baker, drawing in part on Christian sources, argues for a different rendering of the Hebrew. One goat was sacrificed as, rather than for, Azazel, whereas the other was sacrificed as the Lord. If she is right, then, the paradoxical Christian teaching that God the Son, being crucified, is both the victim and the priest, in an act of supreme sacrifice, becomes easier to understand. And it is clear that the links between the Eucharist and the atonement rite are closer than previously realised. Mrs. Baker's broader case is that posterity has understood the importance of the temple worship in the spiritual universe, but only of the Jews, but also of the early Christians, some of whom were temple priests. Her argument is reinforced by the recent findings of John Wilkinson, a former director of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem. Mr. Wilkinson has studied the architectural designs of hundreds of synagogues and Christian churches from the early Christian era, of Georgia and Armenia to Salisbury Cathedral in England, which was begun in 1220 AD. His conclusion is that all these buildings reproduced with some precision certain proportions of the ideal Jewish temple as described by Ezekiel, because the architects set out to copy ratios rather than exact dimensions. The temple influence is not immediately obvious, but it can be discerned, says Mr. Wilkinson, in apparently dissimilar churches. As evidence that Christians self-consciously followed the Jerusalem design, he cites a papal advisor of the 13th century, William Juranus, who said, "Our physical church has taken its form from two buildings, the temple and the tabernacle, but most of the time the temple proportions of church design, Mr. Wilkinson believes, were part of a secret body of orally transmitted knowledge, influenced by the Greek belief that numbers had mystical properties." Whatever the channels through which the temple influenced Christians, the essential point for both Mrs. Baker and Mr. Wilkinson is that Christianity inherited and built on the Jewish belief that it is possible for human beings to have a direct encounter with God and in some sense to become part of divine reality. For the Jews, the temple, specifically the Holy of Holies, was the unique locus for that encounter. For Christians, the equivalent place was the sacred space around the altar of their church, where bread and wine were consecrated and believers were enabled to take part in Christ's life. So how does that arrangement tie in with Mrs. Baker's earlier observations about the worship of the feminine in early Jewish religion, and the transfer of this tradition, or at least its language and metaphors, to Mary? Very closely, she would argue. First, the Christian and Muslim story of the young Mary going into the heart of the temple indicates, in Mary Baker's view, that sex is transcended in the divine reality. That Jewish high priests entered when they made their annual procession into the holiest of holies. There is thus, she argues, a sense in which the priest entering into the holiest of holies ceases to be male. Mrs. Baker, a Methodist preacher herself, concludes that this journey to the place beyond gender can be made by a person of either sex, and there is no reason why women cannot be Christian priests. Conservatives may regard this as feminist claptrap, but whatever they believe about their thorny topic, many Christians may be sympathetic in the stress that Mrs. Baker lies on the traditional story of Mary's early life amongst the temple priests in a place of pure holiness where nobody except the elite caste of males had ever been. Muslims, like early Christians, believed that Mary's mother was expecting a child who would perform unique service to God, and was therefore surprised when her baby turned out to be a girl. Christians and Muslims will never agree on the nature of Mary's child. Was he God incarnate who experienced death and rose again, or a unique inspired prophet who did not die but ascended to heaven? Yet Christians and Muslims alike can see in Mary an affirmation that there is no limit to the holiness or proximity to God, that any human, whether male or female, can attain. Surely that is reason enough for people of any faith to feel reverence for her, history's foremost Jewish mother.